As head of counterintelligence in the previous administration, I have a few things I need to say or would like to say and help you understand, because counterintelligence has the difficult job of stopping spies from stealing our secrets. But they don't have to steal those secrets if Americans are throwing them out the window and into the waiting laps of journalists. So Snowden, Manning, others come to mind. I'd like to use the time I have with you at the podium to do three things: to expose a myth, to confront a paradox, and to appeal for some much-needed leadership in this area. And leadership is something more than just riding the waves of popular outrage. So first, the myth. Myth, it is a myth that leaks don't do any harm. Newsflash, our adversaries read newspapers and they listen to the radio and they have internet access, while the average American may see some secret revealed and think, oh, that's interesting, or I didn't know that, or I don't like that, or, you know, could care less. What they don't see is that the adversaries, hostile governments and terrorists, the adversaries of our national security, are picking up each and every piece and fitting it together into a larger whole that helps feed their ability to hide from us or to deceive us or to carry out the next attack unseen. You know, you may recall back in 1998, there was a leak that said that NSA had the ability to listen in on satellite conversations from bin Laden. Well, what happened? So bin Laden stopped using that phone. And who knows what would have happened had that line not gone dark and we'd actually been able to listen in before 9/11. The volume of cables that Private Bradley Manning passed to WikiLeaks have had repercussions all over the world. They've put the lives of American soldiers at risk and informants in Afghanistan at risk and operations at risk, and that's just for starters. Who do you suppose is going to be willing to talk to U.S. intelligence now that they see all of these leaks out there exposed to public view? And for friendly intelligence services, trusting the Americans to keep the things secret that must stay secret is a far riskier proposition. And our stock, therefore, as an intelligence partner has never been lower, which is not a good thing, especially when we rely so much on liaison services for important human intelligence, especially concerning terrorists. So Manning is going to serve the next 35 years in jail for what he did, which works out to about 1 year per 20,000 documents that he or she, as those of you who prefer, compromised. Edward Snowden is in another class altogether. To call him a whistleblower, as some have amazingly done, is an insult to anyone who actually has come forward to expose wrongdoing. Nor is his crime merely leaking, as serious as that charge may be. I mean, think about it. Here is a man who steals who knows how many gigabytes of highly classified documents and absconds to a safe house in Hong Kong. People on the right, people on the left come together to call him a hero. The Chinese are seen as the good guys for giving him sanctuary and helping him to escape to Moscow, of all places. The United States is criticized around the world for invading people's privacy, and NSA gets pelted with accusations here at home about spying on Americans. The Chinese are portrayed as the cyber victims. The Europeans are up in arms. Putin mocks and belittles us, which is something he seems to enjoy, and the terrorists become even more difficult to find. Reasonable people may ask, what is going on here? So what really is going on here? Well, let's start with what Snowden took and how he took it. 4 months isn't very much time on site, and yet he used his time and access as an IT contractor for NSA in Hawaii to find and download highly classified information that would be of particular value to him. So how did he decide what to take, or how to find it, or to get it out without getting caught? He admitted that he took the contractor job back in March of this year, just so he could gain access to this material, which means that his preparations had been underway for quite some time. The deeper question is at what point along the way he started to get help and from whom. At a minimum, the early leaks were well scripted to provide cover for the rest of his operation, which received far less attention. He passed documents allegedly showing US-UK surveillance of Russian and Turkish government representatives in the G20 meeting. He passed ostensible records of US SIGINT operations. He passed records about plans to counter Chinese cyber operations. He passed budget justifications showing most everything that NSA does, and on and on and on, and that's just what's been reported publicly. Then there's everything else that he stole. For U.S. counterintelligence, this whole case is an unraveling nightmare. At this stage, there's no telling whether he's acted alone or not, or what all he compromised. Whether or not there are audit trails for IT administrators, we can only guess, and if there aren't, then there may be no way of bounding the damage at all. And since we don't know what secrets may have been lost, we won't know who or what may now be at risk. That uncertainty alone is an intelligence bonanza for our adversaries. In the Bush administration, I was responsible for performing these damage assessments, so let me cut to the chase. The damage here is staggering. People do not appreciate it, how badly we've been hurt. But as is almost always the case, evidence of how badly we have been hurt is and must stay classified, at least the best evidence of that. But let me give you a taste of what will happen. U.S. intelligence will continue to erode. There will be future attacks that we do not see coming, which otherwise perhaps may have been prevented. We will not see threats we should have seen, never mind opportunities. We will not be able to protect people and operations we should have been able to protect, and lives will be lost. The President will not have the facts that he needs to have with respect to crucial decisions, nor will the Congress. And this is the slope we are on unless we do something about it. Which brings me to the paradox. You know, one of our most cherished freedoms in America is the freedom of speech. But America's defense requires that certain things be kept secret. In other words, limitations on speech are necessary to preserve freedom of speech and our other freedoms as well. One such limitation with a particularly long and carefully scrubbed legal history concerns the fragile secrets protecting communications intelligence, which is the business of NSA. You know, back in 1931, if I can take you way back in history, a book was published providing a detailed account of American successes in breaking Japanese diplomatic codes. But it didn't break any law because there wasn't any law prohibiting that kind of information from being disclosed. So after the war, there was a joint congressional committee for the investigation of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that committee recommended that legislation be considered along the lines of Britain's Official Secrets Act. That would make it a crime to disclose any kind of classified information. And there have been some similar proposals more recently. Nevertheless, the United States has chosen not to go down the path of an Official Secrets Act, except for one category of classified information. U.S. Code, Section 18 U.S.C. Section 98. Sometimes it's called the Comment Statute, and it features prominently in the indictment against Snowden. This section of the espionage statutes is unique. It protects information about communications intelligence or comment activities from, quote, knowing and willing publication or any other revelation, period. Unlike other sections that are protecting classified information, it does not require a showing of any specific intent to harm the United States or to benefit a foreign nation. The prohibition is intended to bar public speech, period. End of story. Why? Why? Because, as the House Judiciary Committee's report at the time explained, comment activities are both vital and vulnerable to an almost unique degree. Those words were written back in 1950, but they are still very true today to a degree that people really do not appreciate. The U.S. has built a global intelligence apparatus because we have global interests and global responsibilities. We have taken seriously these responsibilities as leader of the free world, as 2 world wars in Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq and freedom fighters across the world can attest. None of these duties could have been met without the exceptional resources of NSA. No other government in the world has comparable capabilities. Successive presidents and Congresses entrusted with preserving and defending our freedom have judged these investments to be vital to our nation's security. The unquestioned qualitative edge of U.S. intelligence has been as essential in defending this nation and preserving our freedom as have the forces that we have built to arm and equip our military. But time has not stood still. China is attacking computer systems throughout the world. They're stealing information and implanting feature-enabled positive control. And their preeminence in IT commercial markets means that they're in the supply chain, and their market share is growing as a part of a purposeful strategy to do that, for strategic position. Then there are also a long litany of spies from Russia and Cuba and other places who have attacked these secrets of U.S. intelligence, and now they have the WikiLeaks and the Snowdens of the world helping them out. So what is to be done? Well, I have some thoughts about the classification system, some changes that need to be made there, and I have some thoughts about what we need to ask of our media, as we were discussing a little earlier. But in the interest of time, I want to bring us quickly to the question of the obligations of leadership. You know, Americans expect their governments to be in their corner and to do all the things that are necessary, consistent with our Constitution, to protect the nation and to advance freedom. And that is precisely why we have expended so much time and energy and treasure and ingenuity in building the remarkable intelligence capabilities we have today. And that is also why any rupture between public confidence and the U.S. intelligence enterprise is so destructive. It is also why America's adversaries have long sought to provoke one. You know, back during the Cold War, the KGB expended an enormous amount of energy and treasure in undermining the credibility and effectiveness of U.S. intelligence in general and of CIA in particular. Their disinformation campaigns included some breathtaking lies, deceptions, and fantastic tales like forged documents and planted news reports and grotesque accusations that CIA was responsible for trafficking in baby parts or assassinating President Kennedy and inventing AIDS. And it took decades for CIA to recover from the Church Committee investigations of the 1970s. And those were years that the Soviets used to advantage in undermining pro-Western governments, supporting insurgencies, and implanting spies. And here we go again. Whatever Edward Snowden may have had in mind when he decided to break his oath, the secrets that he disclosed have been used to discredit U.S. intelligence among the very democratic populations that depend the most on the U.S. defense umbrella. And what may be even worse is the amazing misunderstanding, misperceptions here at home, where the Snowden story has been reduced to, quote, NSA is spying on innocent Americans, unquote. No, they are not. Although that may be the title of Vladimir Putin's next op-ed. Look, this is not the IRS coloring outside the lines. NSA's collection programs are the most rigorously scrubbed and carefully bounded activities of the U.S. government, as anyone who has bothered to read through the reams of FOIA and other disclosures can attest. That includes the one that came out this week about a 7-year-old FISA court opinion that was taking NSA to task for making mistakes or not correcting them quickly enough. You know, before, the critics were saying the FISA court is just a rubber stamp for anything the government wants to do. And now that the FISA court comes out having pointed to NSA's mistakes, it says, aha, NSA is out of control. I mean, really, you're going to have it both ways. In fact, the decisions of our democracy, whether these activities were right and proper and necessary and respectful of civil liberties, have been and continue to be made by the executive, the Congress, and the courts, all acting in accordance with their constitutional responsibilities and the authorities that we, the people, have entrusted to them. And the central decision here is straightforward common sense. If you want to know who the terrorists are talking to in the U.S., you have got to check the phone logs. That is dot connecting 101. No surprises in that, personally. Personally, I find the loss of privacy in today's very digital world, very, very troubling. But it is difficult for me to work up a sense of violation when my phone number is one among billions that the computers churn through looking for terrorist footprints, especially when this is something we need the government to do to keep us safe. And I think that most Americans would agree with that. Yet, I fear that we were spring-loaded to react with suspicion and distrust when these leaks first appeared in the press. Why? Because of the lies about Benghazi, because of the abuse of power by the IRS, because of unilateral decisions by the president to enforce some laws but not other laws, or to assert we can't wait for the Congress except when it's more expedient to wait, as with Syria. Little wonder that people were prepared to believe the worst when they have so repeatedly seen the Republic's trust broken. Now it is up to the leaders in Congress to make sure that U.S. intelligence does not become collateral damage of Obama's failed presidency. Instead of the 19 or more bills that we have pending to try to curtail the FISA court or NSA or the near disaster of the Amash Amendment, Congress should be doing everything in its power to prevent more harm from happening and to find ways to help our nation recover from the harm that Snowden has already caused. And that is my message to you, and I'm happy to talk about it. Sir.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted you were able to get that off your chest, and that we would like to have you come back and say it to a larger group if we can, or some version of it.
Well, it's not the first time I've, quote, gotten it off my chest, unquote.
No, but it's very, very important message. There's several questions, and if I may just ask one myself again. One of the things that seems to have contributed to the Snowden affair, and I suspect as a former counterintelligence executive must be weighing on you greatly, is the condition of the process whereby we are giving people clearances.
Yes.
Would you speak to that and how that did play into this, if at all, but more generally, the concern we should have on that score, and what should we be doing about it?
Well, I know they're looking at questions about what the proprieties associated with Snowden having gotten a clearance. I don't know how that's going to play itself out, but the likelihood is, all the rules were followed and he got a clearance, and there you are. The problem is that we have about 5 million people with clearances these days. There was a rush all of a sudden in this change from need to know to need to share, to bring in a whole bunch of people and give them clearances. Of those 5 million, you got 1.4 million have top secret clearances. We're talking millions. I mean, that's a lot of people. How do you control access when you've got so many people who come in with all of these clearances? So first of all, the population is huge. The standard of need to share means that information is going all over the place, and it isn't very clear sometimes what the accesses really are, and certainly no one is looking at who needs it. There are no standards that say when someone should have a clearance and shouldn't have a clearance in order to do a particular job. There are no common standards that have been developed. That is another problem. And so what happened when all these people came in and got a bunch of clearances is suddenly there are backlogs and backlogs and backlogs of all the personnel files and background investigations that have to get done. So what happens? The government, and this started back in the Clinton administration, starts outsourcing the background investigations. Well, I don't have a problem, per se, with bringing in contractor work to do this, provided they have the training and the expertise and the reliability in order to carry out these background investigations. But as you might expect, there needed to be a rush of new investigators. So you've got a lot of young people coming in. You've got people maybe not very well trained. And you've got the metric of move these cases as fast as you can. We have a backlog. So back in 2005, the average background investigation back then was sort of at the height of when there was all this spike in it, went up to taking about 180 days or something like that to get through the background investigation. And last year, the Obama administration was able to report that they had gotten down initial background investigation time from 180 to 44 days, which is, much better, 44 days, but at what expense? If you're pushing, if the metric is move, 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 what's going to happen? There are going to be some box checking, some corners cut. I mean, I remember there was one guy, and Christine sent me some information about this I was reading before coming in here. There was one investigator who later got fired who actually filled out on a form that he had done an interview with Mr. Frumpty Frump, and it turns out Mr. Frumpty Frump is dead for 10 years. So when you get those kinds of errors, it's a problem. And we need to have a better way of doing these investigations as well. The standard kinds of questions have always been risk from financial exposure or, criminal background, sort of the basic kinds of things, but there is no thought given to how one can screen people for an ideological disposition that is against the U.S. government or a purposeful interest in coming to work for the government in order to hurt it. There's no way of screening for that. It's just not the way that the system is set up. And my final observation is, with all of these wrinkles, problems systemically in the way we do personnel security, you can be sure that there are purposeful espionage organizations out there who are taking advantage of this, because that's what they do.
We have several questions. George, I think you were up first.
George Nicholson, a question I've got. I've had a TS SCI special access clearance since 1968, working for SOCON, JSOC, and predecessor agencies. One of the things that really bothers me about Snowden, I remember when I was at SyncPac, if I were going to go through Hong Kong, I had to go ahead and fill out the paperwork, let my security manager know that I was going to be there, and everything else. I think that sort of still exists. The other thing is with TSA and Homeland Security, my God, how does he get on a flight with 3 laptop computers and the light bulb doesn't come on with somebody? And the other thing is, and Frank, you've seen it too, I would get called in by my security manager. We see that you've downloaded such and such files and everything else. Why are you going into these files? They would keep a record. Who was keeping track of that? And the last quick point, you talk about these security investigations. I went through my last 5-year one a couple of months ago. They said, we have a problem of determining that you really live where you live. And I said, well, none of your next door neighbors know you. Well, I've lived there since 1998. They don't know me. I said, I'm in a secured building. I have a swipe card. Why don't you talk with the concierge? Why don't you talk with the building manager? Every time my car comes in the garage, they've got a photograph. No. Book says have to speak to neighbors.
Right. Right. Well, again, especially that last point, it reflects the lack of experience. A trained investigator would be more creative. The green investigator is coming in, he's got a list, he or she has a list of things, and they just check them off. I hope you do this. I would urge anyone who has security clearance and goes through a background re-up, that when the investigator comes out to talk to you, go through, have the conversation, but then I would urge you to try to do what I do, which is to say to the investigator, do you have a minute to stay after so we can talk? And then give them some feedback on how they did, and do a little career development with these people, because Lord knows they need it.
Claire.
I know most of what we were talking about today here has to do with the stealing of secrets or the revelation of secrets to the enemy in terms of counterintelligence. But I wonder if you could talk just briefly a little bit about the role, if it even still exists, of U.S. counterintelligence to counter, and you mentioned this briefly, influence operations, to recognize and mount countermeasures against influence operations, and then to take on the role of mounting our own influence operations against the enemy intelligence apparatus. Is that even part of the mix anymore?
In time of war, influence operations are something that the U.S. military, also sometimes known as deception operations as well, the U.S. military has done with some success. And yes, it is a part of the counterintelligence mission to do that. In times of peace, it has been very difficult for our country to take on the question of what do we do about purposeful influence operations directed against our leadership or against our public. How do we, as a free country, the free exchange of ideas, deal with that? I find it extremely worrisome that you can have potential agents on behalf of Syria, to take an example that came up earlier, in place, maybe being paid to write op-eds. Well, of course, Putin signs his name to his op-eds, but to write op-eds or things that are going to influence decision makers here. I find that very disturbing. And we do have laws that say one cannot act as an agent of a foreign power without registering first. So that says you can't take money from a foreign power to advance their interests without registering first. Well, that's a law, and that's important that that law be enforced. But the larger question of influence on our democracy, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the world becomes more interconnected and globalization is there. And all I can say is that I take heart from my deep belief that the free exchange of ideas is our strength, and that confronting influence with truth and thought and advocacy based on our values is the way that our democracy is going to flourish and survive and emerge even stronger from it. But I recognize that this is a serious mission, and having the capability to deal with lies that are passed off as reality is something that our nation needs. And maybe we need to have some kind of a government organization or a private sector organization that's going to be involved in the question of validation. Because, I look at people going online and they're doing online searches. What kind of returns are they getting? People tend to amass information and then base decisions on that. How do you know that that's true? It's difficult enough if it's an individual who's making personal decisions. It becomes really dangerous when it's a public official making public policy. And yet open source collection of information is what we do. It's how the world works. You raise a very serious question. I don't have all the answers, but I share your concern about it.
Debbie?
Hi, thanks for coming. This isn't my issue, but I was wondering how you would answer some of the Tea Party conservatives who have lately shifted to the position of concern regarding the metadata collection of their phone numbers, especially in light of the fact that Obama's administration seems to be referring to right-wing extremists as the terrorists, and perhaps they're worried that it'll be a similar thing to whatever happened with the IRS. And also, my understanding is that they're actually collecting phone numbers that are intra-national, not just phone calls abroad.
Well, the way that the metadata program works, which is a business record collection, business record access for NSA, is that all of the business records, which are the phone numbers, time of day of call, where they were called, all the traffic, transactional information is retained by the phone companies. And when NSA has reason to think that they've got their hands on a particular terrorist who may be active and in contact with people here, they can interrogate those business records to see if anything lights up. They have this particular phone number, and what are the phone numbers, if any, that are going to be connected. If anything lights up, and any of those phone numbers, in fact, belong to U.S. persons, they have to go back to the court and get a court order so that they can find out who that is, where that is, and much less touch the content. So I don't see that as an invasion of privacy, and I find it so devastating, really, to see, having devoted my life to being in national security and looking and caring about the good of this country, and also being very much of a conservative activist, to see that part of the party so divided. It's just wrong, and I point to the Obama administration as being responsible, because again, the public has lost their trust in government, and we can't allow that lost in trust to be reverberating back and really harming the things that we need to do to keep us safe. So yeah, my heart goes out on that. It's just, that's what I would say to them. You asked, that's what I would say.
Ryan?
In the continuing debate between liberty and security, what evidence would we provide then for that program? I know that it's all classified, but is there anything we can offer that in terms of a success that comes out of that?
The success, you mean, as far
The
as?
success of monitoring metadata of American citizens' records.
Oh, I know that the ODNI has released some specific numbers. There were about 52 cases cited where from that program and another program, there were leads developed that proved significant in stopping terrorist attacks. So yeah, they've done that scrub, and they've released that information. But it isn't the past ones I'm worrying about right now, it's the next one. The next time something comes through, next time something is going to be imminent. You want to be able to go back and check those phone logs and see who those people are talking to. We've got to have a way to stop them.
Anybody else? If not, I have one more that I'd like to ask you about. It's kind of a variation on the theme, really, of what you've talked about, but picking up on your point about the need to share. You've described that, I think, mostly as share within government agencies as a vehicle for justifying the vast expansion of the number of
Access,
people
it's
who
an
had
access standard, yeah.
had access to this information. I'm looking at this morning's Wall Street Journal, which has on the front page, going back to what we talked about when we first sat down, an article about how Unit 450 in the Syrian army is now feverishly moving around the chemical weapons for which they are responsible in Bashar Assad's army. At last count, according to this report, to some 50 different sites. And what I was struck by was that, I think maybe at several points in that article, but at the very least, as memory serves, the last point gets into some considerable detail as to what we're looking for to monitor the movement of the vehicles that are schlepping this stuff around. And then I heard on the news this morning that one of the things that the U.S. delegation is briefing the Russian delegation on in the Kerry Russian negotiations is what we know about Bashar Assad's chemical arsenal. Now, as a former counterintelligence executive, this must drive you even crazier than it drives me as just somebody who's kind of interested in all this.
Look, Putin
Doesn't
played us
this
so well.
doesn't this really sort of epitomize the practice that has now become institutionalized, that we have to share information, even sensitive, classified sources and methods, revelatory information, with people like Vladimir Putin, the Russian intelligence services, the United Nations,
Right.
the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and on and on and on, in order to be good citizens of the world.
Sure, that's always been the risk calculation, right? And you go into international forums, or it is the Secretary of State speaking to the United Nations, explaining why it's necessary to go into Iraq. the decision to share intelligence information with the world or in a bilateral arrangement or with others is always a cost-benefit assessment, and you've got to make sure that what you're going to get from it is worth what you're going to lose, because we will lose. And Frank, I think you're very right in pointing out that this is an opportunity for the Russians, for others, to really get a better and a more granular feel for our intelligence insights into the region, ours and those of our allies who are helping us with this. So it's the U.S. and others who have intelligence resources here at stake. And I just think that the Russians have played us extremely well. Now they're back in the game. They're back in the Middle East. They're power brokers. They've bought time for their puppet, and they have shown that they're the Deus Ex Machina that's going to come in and help the U.S. out. And by the way, they're getting all this information, this insight that they would not otherwise have. So it's really quite a masterstroke.
And so is Syria. I
And
mean,
so
look,
is
at a moment when we're talking about, going back to Maury's point, getting our hands around the chemical weapons and biological weapons programs of Syria for the purpose of ensuring that we get all of it out and destroyed or under international control or whatever, we're telling them what we know about it, and thereby assuring that what we don't know about it, or at least what we're not willing to own up to knowing about it, is likely to be among the stuff that is squirreled away someplace else.
Yes.
Anyway, Michelle, a fantastically important presentation, and I thank you very much for doing it. I just want to close by saying one thing that an old friend of both of ours, Dr. Michael Waller, shared with me a year or so ago, I think. He was a professor at the Institute for World Politics, and he had a young student who came to him in tears because she had been just so demoralized because while, as with many of their students, her day job, as opposed to her academic program, her day job was working for one of these clearance operations, the background investigation contractors.
Okay.
And she told him that she was so upset because her daily quota for processing these had been upped from 7 to 20. And the question really is, can you actually rubber stamp fast enough to get 20 out the door every single day? And if that, and this was fairly recently, and if that's any indication of what has been going on, it adds, real clarity to the points that you've been making about a process that is now in danger of being very seriously, if not irremediably, broken.
Right. But yet in some cases you have jobs actually have to get done. People that you need to be able to bring in to start the work, you've got to get their background investigations done, and so there's legitimate reason to want to move, in addition to the problem of just this terrible overload.